What does a book know when it stops in the middle of its own breath and refuses to speak the last word? In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only novel, a sea adventure that begins like a story written for boys and ends as something no genre can hold. A slow fall toward a vast, white figure rising out of a milk-white sea. This essay follows that fall through 3 depths: the wreck of the plot, the wreck of the form, and the thought that only this broken book could ever have produced. Is the terror at the heart of Arthur Gordon Pym the ordinary terror of dying, or the far stranger terror of arriving at a meaning that turns out, at the last instant, to be blank? A young man from Nantucket named Arthur Gordon Pym wants to go to sea, and the wanting is already a kind of sentence passed upon him. The book that bears his name opens almost in daylight, almost in comedy. Pym and his friend Augustus, drunk one winter night, take a small boat called the Ariel out into a cold sea for the pleasure of the risk. And the risk very nearly drowns them both. They are run down by a whaler in the dark, hauled half dead from the water. And the reader settles in comfortably for a tale of boyish escapades, the kind a magazine of that decade would serialize for the safe thrill of danger survived. That tale never arrives. What arrives instead is a descent so gradual that the reader registers it only after it has already gone too far to be reversed. Pym, hungry for the sea his family forbids him, has himself smuggled aboard a whaling ship, the Campos, and hidden deep in the hold inside a wooden box, sealed in among the cargo with a little food, a lamp, and a letter from Augustus promising to come for him. The letter is the first thing to fail. Augustus does not come. The hold becomes a tomb. Time dissolves in the dark. The food rots. The lamp gutters. The dog Tiger appears out of the blackness, carrying a scrap of paper smeared with a warning Pym can read only in fragments. Blood is the word that survives. Above his head, while he lies entombed and counting nothing, a mutiny has taken the ship. From here the book stops climbing and begins, irreversibly, to sink. The captain and the loyal men are forced overboard or murdered. Pym, Augustus, and a strange half-wild harpooner named Dirk Peters retake the vessel through a trick that tells you what kind of book this has become. Pym disguises himself as the corpse of a sailor who has died, paints death onto his own face, and walks among the superstitious mutineers as a returning ghost until terror does the killing for him. Then the sea finishes what the men began. A storm reduces the Campos to a waterlogged hulk, a thing that floats but no longer sails. And the survivors cling to it without food, without water, under a sun that will not relent. What happens on that hulk is the hinge on which the whole book turns from adventure into something the language of adventure cannot describe. Starving, half mad, the 4 who remain draw lots to decide who will be eaten so that the others may live. The man who loses, by an irony Poe could not have known he was authoring, is named Richard Parker. He is killed and consumed. Augustus, his arm rotting from an old wound, dies soon after and is given to the sea. And in the middle of this, drifting toward them out of the haze, comes what looks at first like rescue. A fine ship riding gently, a figure at its rail nodding them aboard with what seems a smile. It is a ship of the dead. The nodding figure is a corpse held upright by the gulls feeding on it. And the smile is the work of a seabird lifting its red head from the ruined face. The rescue is a grin made of carrion. Pym and Peters alone are taken up at last by a real ship, the British schooner Jane Guy. And here the narrative changes register again, becomes for a while the calm prose of an exploration log. Latitudes, soundings, the trade in sealskins. The Jane Guy sails south, and the further south she goes, the stranger the world becomes, not colder, but warmer. The sea growing milky and tepid, where it should grow frozen. They reach an island the natives call Salal. And Salal is a place where the law of color has been inverted. Everything there is black. The men, the animals, even the teeth in the men's mouths. And the people of the island are seized with horror at the sight of anything white, recoiling from a white handkerchief, a white sail, screaming a single word, Teklili, as though whiteness itself were an obscenity. Even the water of Salal is wrong. Not clear, but veined with shifting hues that flow side by side without ever mixing, so that a blade drawn through it parts the veins and they close again behind the steel. The island is a trap. The natives, smiling, lead the sailors into a narrow defile and bring the hills down on them, burying the crew of the Jane Guy in an avalanche of engineered earth. Only Pym and Peters survive, hidden in the chasms above, and they find in the walls of those chasms strange shapes, configurations like letters of some lost alphabet that the book lays before the reader without explanation. Escaping at last in a stolen canoe with a single terrified captive named Nunu, they are carried south by a current they cannot fight, into a region of unbearable whiteness. A fine white ash begins to fall from the sky. The sea turns hot and white as milk. Great pale birds rise ahead of them, crying that same word, Tekelili. Nunu dies of pure fright, his lips drawing back from black teeth. And then, across their path, the curtain of falling ash parts, and there rises before the canoe a shrouded human figure, larger than any living man, and the color of its skin is the perfect whiteness of snow. There the book ends. Not concludes, ends. The way a road ends at a cliff. The sentence stops at the threshold of whatever that figure is and refuses to cross it. And everything that has been falling since the first page falls now into a silence the novel will not break. To understand why that silence is the most honest gesture in the whole strange machine, one has to look not at what the book says, but at how it is built. And what it is built of is, in plain truth, wreckage. Poe wrote the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym for money, in installments, with no clear sense of where it was going, and the seams of that improvisation are visible everywhere. The novel does not have a form so much as it has four forms stitched together by a thread that keeps snapping. It opens as a juvenile escapade in the manner of the popular sea story. It becomes a survival horror of mutiny and starvation and cannibalism. It flattens, for long gray stretches, into the dry prose of an exploration narrative, much of it lifted with very little disguise from the real voyage accounts and natural histories Poe had at his desk. Pages on the habits of the penguin and the proper preparation of sea cucumber that sit in the book like ballast, padding a serial that had to reach its length. And then, in its final pages, it abandons realism altogether and becomes pure, apocalyptic dream. A lesser critic would call this incoherence and stop there, and would not be wrong about the incoherence. The book genuinely does not cohere. Characters are introduced and forgotten. The loyal dog Tiger, so vivid in the hold, simply vanishes from the story without a word of farewell. The chronology of the journal entries near the end grows unstable, the dates straining, as though time itself were coming apart as the latitude rises. The documentary apparatus that frames the whole thing, a preface signed by Pym claiming that the opening chapters had already been printed as fiction under the name of a certain Mr. Poe, and a closing editorial note explaining that Pym has since died and that the final chapters of his manuscript have been lost. This apparatus does not resolve the book's confusion. It formalizes it. The frame exists to tell you that the account is incomplete, mutilated, missing its own ending by design. And here is where mere incoherence becomes something far more interesting, because the question the book quietly forces is whether its breakdown is a defect or a method. Consider the long, notorious digression on stowage. While Pym lies entombed in the hold, the narrative pauses to deliver a meticulous technical lecture on the correct stowing of cargo aboard a ship. How goods improperly secured will shift in heavy weather and destroy the vessel from within. It reads, on first encounter, like the worst of the padding. An essay smuggled into a novel to fill column inches. But the digression sits exactly above a hold in which a man has been improperly stowed. A living cargo sealed in the dark that the ship has forgotten, and whose forgetting is itself the engine of the catastrophe to come. The technical realism, the obsessive verisimilitude of nautical detail that Poe deploys precisely to make the impossible ending believable, turns out to be doing the book's deepest work, even where it seems most inert. The hoax is the method. Poe was the great craftsman of the literary hoax, the writer who made fraudulence into a form. And Pym is a hoax that confesses itself in its own preface, and is no less unsettling for the confession, because the reader, warned that this is fiction pretending to be fact, goes on being frightened anyway. So the strongest critical claim one can make about the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is not the dishonest claim that it is a flawless masterpiece. It is plainly not that. The strongest claim is that its greatness is inseparable from its failure, that the book thinks most powerfully at the exact points where it stops working as a book. A novel about a descent that descends into its own incompletability. A manuscript whose frame announces that its conclusion has been lost. A story that ends by refusing to end, is a work in which the broken form has become the argument. The wreck is not an accident that befalls the meaning. The wreck is the meaning, beginning to speak. What then does this ruined and unfinished thing actually know that a finished and orderly thing could not? Its secret subject. The thing it has been circling from the first page without naming is the color white. And the terror that color carries here is unlike any ordinary fear. Jorge Luis Borges, who loved this book, said that its true theme was simply whiteness, and that Poe had managed to make of a color a thing more dreadful than any monster. Everything in the southern half of the narrative bends toward that recognition. The water grows white, the ash falls white, the birds are white, the final figure is white as snow. And the black people of Tsalal, who are themselves the photographic negative of the white world the sailors come from, scream and shudder at whiteness as at the approach of annihilation. Whiteness in Pym is not purity and not peace. It is the color of the void. It is what the world looks like when meaning has been bleached out of it. The blank page on which nothing has yet been written and on which, the book suggests, nothing ever will be. This is the recognition that Herman Melville, who read Pym, would carry into the chapter of Moby Dick on the whiteness of the whale, where he asks why the absence of color, the very emblem of innocence, should strike a deeper panic into the soul than blood or darkness ever could. Melville's answer and Poe's are the same answer. That whiteness terrifies because it is the visible face of meaninglessness, the indifferent blankness behind appearances, the suspicion that when everything has been stripped away, what remains is not God and not the devil, but a colorless, sceneless, dumb white nothing. Pym's whole voyage south is a voyage toward that nothing, an unveiling that promises, at every latitude, that the final revelation is near, and that delivers, when the curtain at last parts, a figure that reveals nothing except the perfect, unreadable whiteness of its own skin. And Poe, who understood the reader's hunger for that revelation better than any writer of his century, builds into the book a cruel and brilliant joke at the expense of that hunger. After the narrative has stopped at the white figure, the editorial note appends a final puzzle. Those strange alphabetic shapes in the walls of the chasms on Tsalal, it informs us, can be read. They correspond, the note explains, to verbal roots in Ethiopic and Arabic and Egyptian, meaning to be shaded, to be white, the region of the south. Here, at the last possible moment, the book hands the reader a decoder, a key, the very thing every reader of a mystery longs for, and the key decodes nothing. It translates the abyss into 3 more words for shadow and whiteness and the south, which is to say it translates the unknown into a restatement of the unknown, and then closes with a line of pseudo-scripture about vengeance graven within the hills. Poe has waited until the reader is most desperate for sense, and has then performed the giving of sense as pure mockery, a meaning-shaped gift box with the void still inside it. The book that thinks where it fails, thinks hardest here. In this fraudulent act of interpretation that exposes how much our craving for the last word is a craving the world has no intention of satisfying. There is a further depth, and it is one the 20th century learned to read. Tsalal, the island where blackness is the law and whiteness the terror, is not only a metaphysical landscape, it is a racial one. And Toni Morrison, reading Pym in her study of the white imagination, saw in it the repressed unconscious of an entire literature. The way the American mind of Poe's moment projected its deepest dread onto an absolute and threatening blackness, only to discover, at the bottom of the descent, that the thing it could not finally face was the blankness of whiteness itself, the empty page of its own self-image. The book stages the fear of the racial other, and then turns that fear inside out, until what rises at the end of the world is not the dark figure the colonial imagination expects, but a white one, vast and shrouded and mute. The return of everything that whiteness had tried to define itself against. Pym does not resolve this. It cannot. It simply arrives at the place where the opposition collapses and stops, because there is nothing on the far side of that collapse that language is equipped to say. This is finally what only this book, written in exactly this broken way, was able to think. That arrival is impossible, and that the deepest dread is not the dread of the journey, but the dread of its end. Every quest narrative ever told promises that the traveler will reach the place and learn the thing. Pym is the quest narrative that goes all the way to the place, parts the last veil, and finds that the thing can't be reached, can't be read, can't be survived, and can't even be finished, because the manuscript that would tell us what the white figure was has been lost, and the man who saw it is dead. A finished, coherent novel could have told a story about meaning. Only an unfinished, fractured, half-plagiarized, self-interrupting wreck of a novel could enact the discovery that meaning, pursued to its absolute horizon, dissolves into a whiteness that gives nothing back. The book had to break in order to think this. Had Poe completed it, tied it off, explained the figure, he would have destroyed the only truth the book contains, which is that there is no last word, only the white silence where the last word should have been. So the canoe rushes on toward the figure, and the figure rises, and the page goes white, and nothing crosses the threshold. The horror of Arthur Gordon Pym was never the cannibalism or the ship of corpses or the buried alive. It was the suspicion, arrived at by a route no argument could have taken, that the human animal sails its whole life toward a revelation that is the color of nothing at all, and that the kindest thing a book can do is to stop exactly there and refuse to lie about what comes next. Where art does not console at autopsies,